Cruel Heir breaks off engagement to a waitress. Years later, she returns with a secret. Julian Montgomery stood in the balcony of his family's estate, overlooking the sprawling grounds of the estate that stretched for miles. His family's wealth had been built on generations of shrewd business decisions, and Julian had been groomed to take over the reins. His tailored suit, his perfectly combed hair, and the polished demeanor all spoke of a man who was used to control. He had everything a man could want: money, power, and the admiration of everyone around him. Or so he thought. Inside, the hum of laughter and clinking glasses filled the grand hall as his friends and family celebrated his recent engagement to Lily Collins, a woman from a humble background. She was young, with a soft smile and big brown eyes, who had once worked as a waitress at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Julian had met her there, during a rare moment when he was taking a break from his hectic life. He had been drawn to her warmth, her intelligence, and the way she seemed unaffected by his name or wealth. But that was before. Back then, Lily had made him feel alive in a way that his gilded world never could. For a while, he had been infatuated with her innocence, her carefree laughter, the way she didn't care about his family's wealth. They had talked for hours, their connection undeniable. But Julian had never imagined she would say yes when he proposed. He'd assumed it would just be an easy, temporary diversion. Now, in the grand hall of his family's estate, surrounded by his high society friends, Julian was starting to feel something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Doubt. The doubts weren't about Lily herself, but about everything else. His life, which had once seemed so simple and full of certainty, was now filled with questions. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe this engagement, maybe everything about his life, wasn't what it seemed. And then he saw her. Lily. She stood at the far side of the room, dressed in a simple yet elegant dress, a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. She looked uncomfortable, almost out of place. While the other women mingled effortlessly, her smile seemed strained. She tried to engage in conversations, but her awkwardness was palpable. She wasn't used to this world, the expensive wine, the designer gowns, the high-class chatter. Julian could see that she was trying, and for a moment he almost felt sorry for her. But that feeling was fleeting. He shook it off. This was her life now. She would have to get used to it. Lily's fingers nervously tugged at the fabric of her dress as she tried to blend into the background. She had never imagined herself here, in the grand halls of Montgomery Manor, surrounded by people who seemed to live in a different world entirely. Julian had told her it would be fine, that she just needed to relax and enjoy the night, but the weight of the stares from the women in their extravagant dresses and the whispered conversations felt suffocating. Her eyes scanned the room, settling on Julian, who was talking animatedly with some of his friends. She smiled softly to herself. She loved him. She had always loved him, even when their worlds seemed so far apart. But tonight, standing in this lavish setting, she felt a growing sense of uncertainty. She had never fit into his world, and she wasn't sure she ever would. When Julian's gaze met hers, he smiled at her, but there was something in his eyes that made her stomach twist. Was it pity? Discomfort? She couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. She had long ago learned to hide her doubts, to push them down so she could be the woman Julian wanted her to be. But the more she watched him, the more she realized that this world he lived in wasn't the life she had imagined for herself. She had grown up poor, struggling to make ends meet, working long shifts at a local diner. She had always dreamed of something more, but she wasn't sure if the life Julian offered was the answer. It felt more like a cage than a future. Her thoughts were interrupted when Julian approached her, his smile bright but a little forced. "Lily, come on. Let's go outside for a bit. You look like you need some air," he said, offering her his arm. She hesitated, then nodded and placed her hand in his. They stepped outside onto the balcony, away from the noise of the party. The cool evening air felt like a welcome relief after the suffocating heat of the ballroom. "Are you okay?" Julian asked, his voice softer now, as though he was trying to be gentle with her. Lily glanced up at him, her eyes searching his face. "I'm fine," she said, offering a tight smile. It's all a bit overwhelming." Julian nodded, but his expression was unreadable. "You'll get used to it. This is your life now, Lily. You can't hide from it." The words hit her harder than she expected. You can't hide from it. As if the life she had known, the life she had built for herself, no longer mattered. She wasn't sure what she expected him to say, but something in his tone made her stomach tighten. She wanted to tell him how much this all hurt, how she felt like a stranger in his world, but she couldn't bring herself to speak the words. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of discomfort for Lily. As Julian's engagement to her became public knowledge, the scrutiny grew. His friends, his family, all expected her to step into a role she had never asked for, and one that didn't fit her. She tried to meet their expectations, tried to behave the way Julian wanted her to, but it was exhausting. And Julian, he seemed distracted. The more time passed, the more distant he became. The charm that had once drawn her in seemed to be fading, replaced with an air of indifference. She could feel him pulling away, like he was growing tired of pretending that their worlds could ever truly be merged. One evening, when Julian asked her to meet him at the estate for a private dinner, Lily thought that maybe things would finally return to normal. Maybe they would have an honest conversation, a real discussion about the future. But when she arrived, Julian was waiting in the living room, his face unreadable. He stood by the window, his back to her as she entered. "Julian," she asked hesitantly. He turned to face her, his expression distant. "Lily," he began, his voice cool, "I don't think this engagement is going to work." Her heart sank, but she didn't say anything. She had already felt it coming. The slow unraveling of everything they had built. The constant tug between the life he wanted and the life she had been trying to build for herself. But hearing him say it aloud felt like a sharp knife to the chest. "I'm sorry," he continued, his voice slightly shaking, "but I can't go through with it. You deserve someone better than me. Someone who can give you the life you want." Lily's throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't speak. All the love she had for him, everything she had sacrificed for this relationship, seemed to vanish in an instant. She wanted to scream, to lash out at him for the pain he was causing, but she held herself together. "I understand," she whispered, barely able to hold back the tears. She turned to leave, not looking back. Julian didn't stop her. The next few years, the weeks after Julian's breakup with Lily, were filled with a haze of social obligations, family pressure, and a deepening sense of emptiness. Despite the lavish parties, the promotions, and the high-profile business deals that kept his schedule packed, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The world he had once controlled with ease, his family, his wealth, his friends, felt suddenly insignificant. The golden cage he had lived in, surrounded by the finest things money could buy, was starting to feel like a prison. He tried to forget Lily, but her absence in his life became more palpable with each passing day. He threw himself into work, buried himself in his responsibilities, and dated other women, each one more beautiful and poised than the last. Yet none of them filled the void she had left. There were times when he would hear a certain laugh or see a fleeting smile from a stranger, and for a brief, painful second, he would think it was her. But then the reality would hit him. He had let her go. He had made the decision to break her heart, all because of his pride, his insecurities, and his fear of being trapped in a life that didn't align with his idea of success. The more he tried to forget her, the more the guilt gnawed at him. Lily's transformation. Meanwhile, Lily's life had been radically different. After the breakup, she left Montgomery Manor and returned to her roots. She moved to a small apartment in the city, away from the opulence of the life Julian had offered her, and found a steady job managing a cafe. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She no longer had to fit into Julian's world. She had built a new one for herself, one that didn't need the validation of anyone else. Though Julian's departure from her life had devastated her at first, she had found strength she didn't know she had. Over the years, she cultivated a quiet resilience. She rebuilt her sense of self-worth, and in doing so, she also found a career that truly suited her. The cafe had flourished under her care, and she had learned the true value of hard work and independence. Still, despite her newfound sense of independence, Lily couldn't entirely forget Julian. Their relationship, though brief, had been a transformative chapter in her life. But she had made peace with it. He had chosen his path, and she had to choose hers. She didn't need him. She had learned that. The unexpected return. It was on a crisp autumn day, nearly 4 years after the breakup, when Lily's past came rushing back into her life. She was sitting in the cafe, wiping down the counter, when the bell above the door jingled. She didn't look up at first, assuming it was a regular customer. But then she heard the voice, the one voice she hadn't thought about in years. "Excuse me, miss, can I get a coffee to go?" Lily's hand froze on the cloth as the voice registered in her mind. Her heart skipped a beat as she slowly turned, her gaze falling on Julian Montgomery. Time had changed him. His hair was slightly shorter, his jaw more chiseled, his expensive suit now replaced with a dark overcoat. But the arrogance in his eyes, the same piercing gaze that had once looked at her with such indifference, was unmistakable. He didn't recognize her at first. His eyes scanned the counter, and for a moment, Lily felt a pang of nostalgia, a flash of who they had been before everything went wrong. She stood there, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. "Is the coffee too much trouble?" Julian asked, raising an eyebrow when she didn't move to take his order. He didn't seem to notice her hesitation, his voice casual as if it was any other day. Lily blinked, her thoughts racing. He didn't remember her. He didn't know she was the same woman he had once been engaged to. A wave of anger and bitterness rushed over her, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice steady, though her emotions swirled beneath the calm exterior. "I'll get that for you right away." As she turned to prepare the coffee, her mind was racing. The encounter felt surreal. He had come back into her life as if nothing had happened, as if years of silence, heartbreak, and distance hadn't existed. She couldn't decide if she was angry or indifferent, but deep down, she knew there was more to this moment than just an ordinary interaction. She handed him the coffee, and their fingers brushed ever so slightly, sending a jolt through her that she hadn't expected. He noticed, finally, the faint recognition in her eyes, the flicker of something familiar. It was subtle, but it was there. "Lily?" he asked, his voice softer now, a note of disbelief in his tone. She nodded, her smile tight. "It's me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Julian stared at her, searching her face as if trying to piece together the years that had passed since they last saw each other. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice almost tentative now. Lily crossed her arms, her posture shifting to one of quiet confidence. "I've been good, Julian. Life's been good." She let the words hang between them, offering nothing more. He seemed to process her words, his eyes narrowing slightly as though unsure of what to make of her sudden composure. "I'm glad," he finally said. "I always wondered how you were doing." Lily tilted her head slightly. "Did you?" Her voice carried a hint of bitterness now. "You didn't seem to care much when you broke off our engagement." The words came out harsher than she intended, and for a brief moment, Julian seemed taken aback, guilt flashing across his face. He started, but Lily interrupted him, holding up her hand. "You don't need to explain, Julian," she said calmly. "You made your choice, and I made mine." There was a long silence, during which Julian seemed to struggle to find the right words. The air between them felt thick with the weight of the past, unspoken truths, and unresolved emotions. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said finally, his voice more sincere than she remembered. "I made a mistake, and I regret it every day. But it's too late for that now, isn't it?" Lily's heart twinged, but she quickly pushed the emotion away. She wasn't that woman anymore, the one who would let herself be swept away by his words. She had grown too much, learned too much in the years since their breakup. "It's not about what's too late, Julian," she said softly, her eyes locking with his. "It's about what you've learned." "And what I've learned." His expression softened, and for the first time since their breakup, Lily saw vulnerability in his eyes. He was no longer the arrogant, privileged heir. He was a man who had faced the consequences of his own actions. "What is it you've learned?" he asked, almost pleadingly. Lily took a deep breath, her hands steady as she folded them in front of her. "I've learned that I don't need anyone's validation to know my worth. I've learned that I am enough on my own. I've learned that I don't need your approval to be happy." Julian looked down at his coffee, the weight of her words sinking in. The silence stretched between them, each of them caught in their own thoughts. Lily's heart raced, but she felt a sense of calm. She had come to a place of peace in her life. The secret she had been carrying for years, the one that could shatter everything Julian thought he knew, was still hidden. But in this moment, she didn't need to reveal it. "Not yet. I don't know what I'm hoping for, Lily," Julian finally said, his voice quiet. "Maybe I'm hoping for forgiveness. Or maybe I just want to see you happy." Lily looked at him, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Forgiveness isn't something you can just ask for, Julian. It's something you earn." And with that, she turned and walked away. Julian's reflection. The next few days passed in a blur for Julian. He couldn't shake the image of Lily, her calm, steady demeanor, her confident words. She had changed, and yet somehow she was the same. The woman who had once been so full of life and hope, now standing tall, unafraid to speak her truth. Julian had spent years surrounding himself with people who feared him, admired him, or simply wanted something from him. But Lily? She had never been impressed by his wealth, and now it seemed she had built a life for herself without needing his approval. He thought back to their breakup, to the way he had treated her as disposable, his arrogance clouding his judgment. He had truly believed that he could walk away, that she would simply wait for him to come back, that she was a part of his life that could be easily discarded. And yet, in her absence, she had flourished. He had watched her from a distance, seeing small reports in the papers about the success of her cafe, and part of him had felt a pang of guilt. He had always thought she'd be swallowed up by her circumstances, that she couldn't possibly rise above her position. But she had. Now, standing in front of the cafe where they had first met, Julian was filled with conflicting emotions. He had been back here countless times, but today felt different. The building hadn't changed. It was still modest, unassuming, but to him, it had taken on a new significance. This was the place where his assumptions about Lily had first been challenged, where his pride had first been tested. Lily's secret. Lily spent the days following her encounter with Julian, reflecting on what had transpired. Part of her had wanted to tell him everything, to reveal the secret she had been carrying for so long. She could feel the weight of it in her chest, an unbearable burden that had become harder to keep hidden with each passing year. She had built her life around this secret, and yet it was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. What would happen if she told him the truth? What if revealing the secret tore down everything Julian had rebuilt in his life? But was that what she wanted? To ruin him? To make him face the consequences of his actions after all these years? Or had she already done enough? The truth was, she hadn't known what she wanted from this confrontation. She hadn't planned on seeing him again, let alone speaking to him. But something about his presence, his vulnerability, had stirred something inside her. And now she found herself at a crossroads. She sat in her apartment that evening, the dim light of the lamp casting long shadows across the room as she stared out the window, lost in thought. She had worked so hard to build her life, her independence, her business, her peace of mind. To tear that all down, to reveal her past to Julian, seemed like an impossible choice. The decision weighed heavily on her. Her hand instinctively reached for the necklace that hung around her neck, a delicate silver chain with a small locket. Inside the locket was a picture, a memory that only she knew, the secret she had carried all these years. Julian's apology. The following evening, Julian found himself standing outside the cafe again, looking up at the small sign that read Collins Cafe. He had debated whether to come here to find Lily and ask for a second chance. But after their conversation, he knew that wasn't enough. He had hurt her, abandoned her, and now, in some strange twist of fate, he was asking for redemption. His hand hovered over the door handle, but just before he could enter, the door opened, and there she was. Lily. Her eyes widened when she saw him, but she quickly composed herself, not giving away any emotion. She stepped aside to allow him entry, but Julian hesitated. "I didn't expect you to come back," Lily said quietly, her voice calm but guarded. "I thought you had moved on." "I thought I had too," Julian replied, his voice filled with an unfamiliar sincerity. "But I can't stop thinking about you, about us." Lily didn't say anything at first. She simply turned and walked inside, motioning for him to follow. "Why are you here, Julian?" she asked, her tone still neutral, but there was a hint of curiosity in her voice. I came to apologize," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I treated you horribly, and I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. More sorry than you'll ever know." Lily stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. Why now, after all this time? Her voice softened, but the pain was still evident. "Why didn't you apologize back then, when it mattered?" "I didn't know how," Julian confessed, stepping closer. "I was too proud, too blind to see what I had. I didn't deserve you then. And I'm not sure I deserve your forgiveness now." The vulnerability in his voice hit Lily harder than she expected. She had never thought she'd hear him speak this way, with such raw honesty. It was almost like he had shed his armor, and for the first time, she saw the man behind the wealth, the heir to the Montgomery name. "You hurt me, Julian," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "You broke my heart, and I spent so many years trying to forget. But you weren't just cruel to me, you were cruel to yourself, to your own feelings. And now you're asking for forgiveness. But it's not enough." Julian stepped closer, reaching out to her. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to make things right. I want to do something that proves I've changed, that I've learned." Lily looked at him, her heart torn between the love she once felt for him and the scars he had left behind. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what was to come. "Julian," she said, her voice low. "There's something you need to know. Something I've kept hidden all these years." The secret revealed. The words hung in the air, thick with anticipation. Julian's gaze softened, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "What is it, Lily?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily took a step back, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the locket around her neck. She held it in her hand for a moment, then opened it, revealing the small, faded photo inside. She handed it to Julian. He took the locket in his hands, staring at the picture of a small child, no older than a few years. His eyes widened, confusion and disbelief taking over his expression. "Who is this?" Lily's voice faltered as she spoke. "This is our son, Julian." Julian's shock. Julian stood frozen in place, his mind reeling as his eyes locked onto the image of the child in the locket. His heart raced as his brain struggled to process what Lily had just told him. Their son? His hands began to tremble slightly as he held the locket, staring at the photo in disbelief. The room around him seemed to blur, the sound of his own pulse pounding in his ears. Lily's gaze remained steady, though her lips trembled. "I never told you because I didn't know how. After everything, after what you did, I thought it was better to raise him without you to give him the life he deserved. I didn't want him to grow up with the confusion of being part of a world that wasn't his." Julian's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the air. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you give me a chance to?" Lily shook her head, cutting him off. "What chance did I have, Julian? You made it clear that I wasn't enough. You made it clear that we didn't belong in your world, that I didn't belong. And I believed you. I thought you'd never accept our son, never accept me, not with who I was." The weight of her words hit him like a brick. He had been so arrogant, so sure of himself, so blind to the consequences of his actions. His chest tightened as guilt surged through him. "I was wrong, Lily. I see that now. But I was a fool, a coward. And I'm sorry." Lily closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the sting of his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that this apology meant something. But the pain of years without him, raising their child alone, having to carry that burden herself, was something she couldn't just erase. "You can't undo the past, Julian," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "And neither can I. But this child, our son, he's my world now. He's everything to me. He deserves more than apologies, more than words." Julian closed his eyes, unable to look at her as the full impact of what she had said settled into his chest. Their son. He had been a stranger to him, a part of his life he had never known, a part of Lily's life he had never considered. The weight of regret pressed down on him. He had been so obsessed with his pride, so focused on maintaining his perfect image, that he had failed to see the woman he loved, the woman who had carried their child, and the life they could have shared. Lily's resolve. Lily's eyes softened as she saw the genuine regret in his face. But it didn't change anything. She had learned to live without him, and she had made peace with that. Their son was her responsibility, and if Julian was truly sincere in his regret, he would have to prove it. "I didn't come here to make you feel guilty," she said, her voice steady. "I came here because it was time you knew the truth. But I won't let you walk back into our lives just because you're feeling guilty. You'll have to show me that you're worthy of being a part of his life." Julian nodded, his throat tight as he struggled to find words. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I want to be a part of your life, of his life." Lily looked at him, her expression softening just a little, though she was still cautious. "Actions speak louder than words, Julian. Show me you can do more than just apologize. Show me you're willing to fight for what really matters." He nodded again, his voice firm. "I'll prove it, Lily. I swear." Lily studied him for a long moment before finally speaking again. "I need to go. It's late, and I have to get back to the cafe." Julian hesitated, then spoke quickly. "Can I see him? Just once? I won't intrude. I just need to see him to know he's real. I need to see the person I've missed out on for so long." Lily sighed, her emotions churning. She hadn't expected him to ask, but there was a part of her that couldn't deny the longing she saw in his eyes. Their son. Her son deserved to know his father, even if it meant confronting her past again. He's asleep. But if you really want to see him. She trailed off, her heart in her throat. It wasn't an easy decision, but she knew it was the right one. He needed to face the consequences of his actions. The first meeting with their son. The next evening, Lily stood in the small living room of her apartment, watching as Julian nervously glanced around. It had been years since he'd been in a space like this, humble, modest, yet filled with the love and warmth that came from a life built on hard work and perseverance. She led him down the hallway to her son's room. The soft light from the nightlamp cast a warm glow over the small room, which was filled with toys, books, and colorful drawings. The small crib by the window was where their son slept peacefully, unaware of the visitors standing at the door. Julian stood at the doorway, his gaze softening as he looked at the child. His heart ached, and for the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable, exposed. He was not the wealthy heir, the powerful businessman. He was just a man staring at the child he never knew he had. Lily watched him quietly, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sure how to feel. She wasn't sure if Julian's appearance in their son's life would be a blessing or a burden. I never imagined, Julian's voice faltered, his eyes fixed on the child. I never imagined this moment. Lily stepped forward, her voice firm but soft. It doesn't change anything, Julian. You've missed so much already. If you want to be a part of his life, you'll have to earn it. I will, he whispered, a promise in his tone. I'll earn it, Lily. I swear. The silence between them stretched, both of them lost in their thoughts as they watched the child sleep. In that moment, there were no words left to say. Only time would tell if Julian's regret would translate into action. The days that followed. Over the following weeks, Julian tried to keep his promise. He didn't show up uninvited. He didn't force his way into Lily's life, but he made every effort to prove that he was serious. He came by the cafe when he knew she would be working, not to interrupt but to offer help, whether it was promoting her business or simply being present when things got tough. He helped fix broken equipment and even volunteered at the local shelter she supported. Though Lily kept her distance, she noticed the change. She saw the man who had once been arrogant and dismissive now humble, patient, and willing to listen. It wasn't a transformation that happened overnight, and Lily wasn't quick to forgive, but she had to admit that something had shifted in him. Julian's visits became more frequent, and over time, Lily began to soften. It wasn't just about what he could do for her. It was about how he treated their son, how he interacted with him, how he gently made an effort to get to know him, even when the boy didn't yet fully understand who he was. Lily watched from a distance, her heart cautious, but there was something in her that began to hope. Hope that Julian might finally become the man he had always been capable of being. The struggle of trust. As the days passed, Julian's presence in Lily's life began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a quiet, tentative attempt to rebuild something lost. But rebuilding trust was not an easy task, and Lily had to remind herself, every day, that this was not the same man who had once left her brokenhearted. This Julian was different, softer, more aware of the weight his past mistakes had carried. Yet, despite his efforts, Lily could not allow herself to trust him completely, not yet. Every time Julian came by the cafe, she felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for his support, annoyance at the memory of his betrayal, and sometimes something she couldn't quite name, hope. It wasn't that she wanted him back in her life. She had moved on, and her son needed stability. But she couldn't ignore the subtle pull she still felt toward him. One afternoon, as she was arranging some new flyers at the counter, Julian came in, his usual quiet smile greeting her. His presence was familiar now, like a steady rhythm in her life that, for better or worse, she had come to expect. I finished helping with the fundraiser flyer you mentioned, Julian said, sliding a set of papers onto the counter. Lily glanced up, meeting his eyes. He looked different, genuine, like he wanted to make up for the years he had wasted. Thanks, she replied, taking the papers and organizing them. He hesitated before speaking again. Can I see him? Just for a minute. The request was simple, but the weight behind it felt heavier than she expected. Every time Julian asked about their son, Lily's resolve faltered. She had always been the one to protect her son from the unknown, from the hurt of a father who had abandoned him. But now, seeing how Julian had changed, it became harder to deny him the chance to be a father. I'm not sure he's ready for a visit just yet, Lily said, trying to keep her voice steady. Julian nodded, his expression softening. I understand. I'm not asking for more than what he's willing to give. I just want to try. Lily could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for a moment she considered it. Maybe it's time, she thought. Maybe it's time to let him have the chance to prove himself. But the fear that still gripped her heart made her hesitate. What if he hurt their son? What if, after all this time, Julian couldn't be the father he wanted to be? The thought made her stomach churn. I'll think about it, Lily said, her voice quiet. But right now, it's still too soon. The unexpected visit. A few weeks later, Julian arrived at the cafe just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the floor. He had become a regular visitor, always helping, never pushing, never demanding. But today, he was different. His posture was tense, his movements slower than usual, as if something weighed heavily on his mind. Lily, he said, his voice hesitant as he approached the counter. Lily glanced up from her work, startled by the change in his demeanor. What's wrong? I need to talk to you, Julian said softly, his voice edged with anxiety. About our son. Her heart skipped a beat. What about him? I've been thinking about what you said. About proving I can be part of his life, Julian said, his hands shifting uncomfortably. But I've realized something. I've been trying to prove it to you, to him, to everyone. But what if I've been going about it the wrong way? What if I'm not ready for what this really means? Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't know what he meant, but the vulnerability in his voice made her uneasy. Julian was usually so composed, so sure of himself. Seeing him like this, questioning his ability to be a father, was a side of him she hadn't seen before. What do you mean? She asked, her voice quiet, unsure of where this conversation was headed. I've been doing all this, Lily, helping out with the cafe, showing up, apologizing, but I'm not sure it's enough. I'm not sure I'm prepared for what this really means, he confessed, his eyes searching hers. I've spent my whole life trying to control everything. But fatherhood, it's not something I can control. It's not about proving I'm worthy. It's about being there, every day, no matter what. And I don't know if I'm ready for that. I want to be, but I don't want to make promises I can't keep. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything Julian had just admitted. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in years. The vulnerability in his voice, the uncertainty in his eyes, made her pause. She could see that Julian wasn't running from the responsibility anymore. He wasn't offering her empty gestures or pretending that he had all the answers. He was acknowledging the complexity of the situation, the difficulty of stepping into a role he hadn't prepared for, and the emotional toll it would take on him and everyone involved. Lily's heart softened, but she was still cautious. She couldn't ignore the years of hurt, the pain of being abandoned when she had needed him the most. Still, the sincerity in his voice gave her a small flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't as lost as I thought. I've been raising him alone for so long, Lily said, her voice quiet but firm. I've done it without you, and I've made peace with that. But I won't let him down again, and I won't let you hurt him. If you want to be part of his life, Julian, you have to show me that you're ready. You have to show him, too. Julian nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. I know. I understand. I'm willing to do the work, Lily. For him. For you. Lily studied him for a long moment, weighing her options. She had been through so much alone, had carried the burden of their son's future without him. But the man standing before her now was not the same arrogant Heir she had once known. He was someone who had started to face his flaws, his weaknesses, and he was willing to change. Let's take it one step at a time, she finally said. You can meet him, but only when he's ready. And you'll have to prove yourself, Julian. Every single day. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I will. I promise. The first meeting. The following Saturday, Julian stood outside Lily's apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been weeks since their conversation, and now finally he was going to meet his son. The boy he had never known, the boy who was part of him, yet a stranger to him. Lily opened the door and smiled at him, but there was a hint of caution in her eyes. She had agreed to this meeting, but it was clear she was still guarded, still unsure of what this meant for their future. He's inside, she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Julian followed her down the hallway to the small bedroom where their son slept, the quiet hum of his breathing filling the air. Lily pushed the door open, and Julian's gaze fell on a small child lying peacefully in the crib. His heart swelled in his chest, and for a moment he was speechless. Lily stood beside him, watching him carefully. His name's Noah, she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet pride. He's everything to me. Julian nodded, his eyes never leaving the boy. He's beautiful. Lily turned toward him. Do you think you're ready for this, Julian? To be a father? Julian took a deep breath, his eyes still focused on Noah. I don't know, but I'm willing to try. I'll do whatever it takes. Lily didn't respond right away. She simply watched him, her heart torn between hope and caution. But something in Julian's eyes made her believe that maybe, just maybe, he was ready. Julian's commitment. Days turned into weeks, and Julian's visits became more frequent. He wasn't just showing up at the cafe anymore. He was present in every aspect of their lives, doing more than just offering empty promises or fleeting gestures. His actions spoke louder than his words. He was there when the cafe needed repairs, helping with the labor, and even offering to sponsor some of the upgrades. He spent time with Lily, not only supporting her business but genuinely getting to know her, asking about her dreams, her fears, and her past. He listened in a way he had never listened before, absorbing her experiences with a quiet reverence that was both new and humbling. But the true test came when Noah, their son, began to show signs of warmth toward Julian. At first, Noah had been shy, hesitant to trust the stranger who had suddenly appeared in his life. But Julian was patient. He didn't rush things. He played with him, brought him small gifts, and slowly but surely he gained the boy's trust. Lily watched as Julian's relationship with Noah blossomed. Every time he stepped into their world, he seemed to settle into the role of fatherhood more comfortably. It was clear that he was putting in the effort, that he wasn't going to give up. The tenderness in his eyes when he looked at Noah, the way he spoke to him, the joy he found in the small moments, they all spoke of the transformation he had undergone. Julian wasn't the same man who had walked out on them years ago. He was becoming someone who truly cared. The moment of truth. One late afternoon, as the cafe was quiet and the golden hour sunlight filtered through the windows, Julian and Lily sat across from each other at a table. Noah was playing in the corner, happily occupied with his toys. There was a peacefulness in the air, a feeling that, for once, things were right. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Julian began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. About proving myself. About being more than just words. And I realize now that I've been trying to show you that I can be the father Noah deserves, but I haven't said what really matters. What I'm really here to say. Lily looked at him, her heart in her throat. She had come a long way from the woman who had once sworn to never trust him again. But now, seeing him sitting across from her, there was something in his eyes, a sincerity she had never seen before. Julian took a deep breath, his hands resting on the table. Lily, I don't just want to be a part of Noah's life because it's the right thing to do. I want to be his father because I truly love him. I love him as my own. And I want to do this, not because I owe it to you or to him, but because I owe it to myself. I owe it to us. Lily's breath caught in her chest as she listened. Her instincts told her to remain guarded, but something in his words stirred the walls she had built. She had seen him try, seen him fail, but this was different. His eyes, full of sincerity, no longer held arrogance or detachment. Instead, they reflected a deep understanding of the responsibility he was taking on. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you completely, Julian, she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of the years that had passed. But I know that what you're offering is real. I can see it now. And maybe that's enough. Julian reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. His touch was tentative but genuine, a silent promise that he was not giving up. I'll earn it, Lily. Every day, I'll earn it. For you. For Noah. Lily felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at him. She wasn't ready to let go of her fears completely, but she knew, deep down, that Julian was trying. He wasn't the man who had left her shattered all those years ago. He had changed. And in his change, she saw the possibility of healing, not just for him, but for their family. A new beginning. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But as the weeks turned into months, Julian proved to Lily, and to himself, that he was capable of the change he had promised. He didn't just want to be a part of Noah's life, he became a real part of it. Noah grew to love him in his own way, not as a replacement for the father figure he had never had, but as someone who cared for him, supported him, and wanted to be there for him. Slowly, Lily began to open her heart again, not just to Julian, but to the possibility of what their family could become. One Sunday afternoon, as they all sat together in the park, Noah running ahead to play while Lily and Julian walked hand in hand behind him, Lily couldn't help but smile. It was a quiet moment, but it was one that spoke volumes. She had learned to let go of her anger, to forgive him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The healing wasn't just about Julian. It was about her too. She had been strong, had raised Noah on her own, and had found peace in doing so. But now she didn't have to do it alone anymore. Looking over at Julian, his face filled with warmth as he watched their son run around with a carefree smile, Lily knew that their journey was just beginning. There was still a long road ahead, but they were walking it together. The final step. Months later, the cafe was thriving, and Noah had started school. Julian had become more than just a regular visitor. He was now a permanent, loving presence in their lives. They had all come to a place of understanding, a place where the past didn't have to define them. One evening, as the cafe was closing and the last customers trickled out, Julian and Lily stood side by side, cleaning up. The quiet of the space allowed them to speak freely without distractions. "I'm glad I came back, Lily," Julian said, his voice soft. "I know it took time, but I'm grateful you let me in. I'm grateful you let me be a part of this." Lily smiled, her heart full. "I'm glad to. I think we're ready for this, Julian. All of it. Together." He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "So am I," he said, his voice filled with affection. "I'm here, Lily. For you. For Noah. For us." And as they stood there, amidst the warmth of their cafe, the place that had symbolized Lily's strength and independence, she realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where love, redemption, and second chances were possible.